Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Have Western politicos and media abandoned Ukraine? This country may have dropped out of the headlines, but its problems only multiply with every passing day. The West's forced regime change has not brought peace and prosperity. In fact, Ukraine as a unitary state is in question. To CrossTalk Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Eric Kraus in Moscow. He is an independent political risk analyst. Also in Moscow, we have Charles Bausman. He is the editor of Russia Insider. And in London, we cross to Alexander Mercouris. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Charles here in Moscow, if I can go to you first here. I visited your website today, Russia Insider. There's quite a bit of coverage of what's going on in Ukraine. It's not good, but if you go to Google News and type in Ukraine news, it's kind of dropped off a cliff. How do you explain that? Has the Western narrative just completely collapsed, or is it just news flow?
Well, Peter, there's a lot of other big news that's pushing it off the headlines in the last few days. We've got Ebola, first of all, ISIS, and financial markets are melting down. So that's understandable. But no, the Ukraine is still a huge story, and it's going to come back in a very big way. One of the things that I would say covering the story is that the media just really isn't getting this right. They haven't gotten it right so far, and they're just not telegraphing at all how bad it's going to get and how big it's going to be and how much effect it's going to have on European and American politics going forward. Okay, so it's still a big story. Alexander in London, I heard you agreeing. Go ahead, elaborate.
Well, I do agree, but I would say also that there is to some extent a degree of intention about this, in that I think that there is an intention not to report the Ukraine as much as there was, say, a few months ago, to report it, precisely because the story has gone so terribly and catastrophically wrong. And I mean, I understand that one doesn't want to talk about collusion and people being controlled in the media, but I think that the Western media collectively took a very certain line on the Ukraine, and now they are frankly very embarrassed and are in great difficulties trying to explain both to themselves and to their customers why that line isn't working out.
Yeah, hey, Eric, if I can go to you here in Moscow, I mean, no one's going to get fired for bad coverage of Ukraine, will they?
Well, probably not. Being a journalist means never having to say you're sorry. But frankly, I've given up hope on the media. What I find extraordinary in this story is European diplomacy. The Europeans went into this, basically our policy on Ukraine, there is no exit strategy. There is no possible way that this is going to work out the way they want it to. And they've got a meltdown on their hands, and this is going to be fabulously expensive, and they do not have the money to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
You know, okay, Charles, I mean, what was the game plan out there? You know, how did this all start? Let's go from the coup. What was supposed to happen? We all know what has happened. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I want to take issue a little bit about what Alexander said in terms of this being sort of intentional desire to not tell the story. I don't think that's the case. I think this is a case of incompetence. And the U.S., the Western media just, they did not understand what was going on when they went into this story. And they are now just backpedaling and trying to figure out what to do. And honestly, they're just confused. So that would be the sort of the main thing I would say about the Western media.
Yeah, but the media are commercial organizations, mate. I mean, they've got to spell advertising space, and they've got Ebola now, which has got everybody very excited. So they forget stories relatively quickly.
Okay, but let me go to Alexander here. Hang on, guys. But Alexander, I mean, fine. I mean, I've come across journalists all through my life that are incompetent because they're thrown into a story that they have no idea what they're supposed to report. They may have some help on the ground, but that might be biased. But let's look at policymakers, because what we have here is, we have journalists repeating. I mean, if you go to the State Department briefings, it's the union of stenographers. They just write it down. This is the problem here. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, indeed. I mean, There's one point I would say about what Charles said, which is, of course, that the Ukraine is a huge story. It hasn't gone away. It's actually getting worse. The situation there is deteriorating by the day. If you go to Charles's news site, Russia Insider, you'll find a host of articles showing how the elections there are further destabilizing the situation, how the economic crisis is deepening, how the military situation is awful, and all of this ought to be reported. And the fact that it is not reported begs the question why. And I don't think it can just be explained away by a matter of news flow.
Yeah.
Now, coming back to an earlier question that you asked about the diplomacy and the politics of this, I happen to think that the Europeans and the Americans went into the Ukraine with a certain defined aims. Those aims are not working out. But I certainly don't think they just blundered into this.
Okay, well, because Eric, because it didn't work out, they are blundering. Okay, that's one thesis. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, well, they had aims, but the probability of them attaining the aims was nil, simply because to put Ukraine back together again, we are talking about hundreds of billions of euros. We are talking about something approximately of an order of magnitude of what it cost to reunite East and West Germany. Now, those were much healthier, those were much richer times, and you had one country which was willing to take the expense. Mr. Poroshenko went to Washington and came home with a very generous, I believe it was about $70 million, which is about a day and a half of his cash outflows. So it didn't really set things right. So they had, I agree with Alexander, they went in with aims, but they went into Iraq with aims too. Unfortunately, there was never any possibility that they were going to attain the goals that they had set themselves using the means. And so basically we're getting to a situation here, if you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and hoping for a different outcome, and that is what they're doing.
Charles, you know, but Eric just said, you know, what it will take to you know, keep Ukraine together, but it is broken. We have Novorossiya. You know, you may not want to pronounce the word, or no one wants to write it in the West, but this is a reality on the ground right now. Ukraine is permanently broken now, or said differently, it will never be the way it was a year ago. Go ahead, Charles, here in Moscow.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And as usual, the Western media is behind the 8 ball on this, because not only is Novorossiya, in other words, East Ukraine, going to break off and be a separate country, but the rest of the country is literally falling apart. They've got the neo-Nazi West, they've got the center that's fighting with them. Everybody's at each other's throats. The gas is getting turned off. It's getting cold. It's wintertime. Honestly, I'd like to ask my fellow colleagues here. I mean, anybody want to take any bets on how long Poroshenko is going to be president? I'd give him 2 months, 3 at the max. 3 at the max.
All right, Charles. Charles stole my question. I was going to ask that at the end of the program, but let's ask it right now. Charles asked the question: how long do you think Poroshenko is going to last? Eric, go ahead.
About 2 days ago. I don't think that he's got much of a chance, because he is, in fact, you know, basically this is supposed to be a government which is going to reform Ukraine. And it's a government of oligarchs and backed by a small but important neo-Nazi faction. Now, this does not sound like an obvious reform platform to me.
It doesn't sound it that way.
So, I mean, I give him a couple of months.
And Eric, you should add also that those oligarchs, I mean, they are in the great style of criminal capitalism, and these people are basically thieves and criminals before all else.
Okay. Oh,
you know,
come on, give democracy a chance. Give democracy a chance. That's what we're going to hear in Washington. Alexandria in London, you've been very patient. Go ahead.
Yes, I think Mr. Poroshenko has one thing working for him, and that is that the alternatives to him are frankly so terrible that he is almost, if one can say, the least bad option. The other thing is, Charles talked about how the Ukraine is falling apart. If Mr. Poroshenko goes, it's very difficult to see how that process will not accelerate. So overthrowing Mr. Poroshenko could very well disintegrate more quickly what is left of the Ukraine. And that might be what keeps him going in a kind of state of suspended animation. So yes, I do think eventually he will go, because I don't think the situation in the Ukraine is viable. But I think he may be there rather longer than perhaps Charles and Eric expect.
The problem, I think, in the Ukraine at this point is that there is no solution which anyone can envision. Obviously, after the amount of violence which has been done to people in the East, they do not wish to climb. They do not wish to be governed by the Kiev regime. On the other hand, Russia does not wish to integrate the two eastern provinces, what we call Novorossiya, because it would be hugely expensive and it would be very hard to control. It's not like Crimea, which was ethnically fairly homogeneous. So we can't. No one can really think of a possible outcome here.
Eric, I wouldn't really agree with that. I have a very sort of clear conviction of where I think this is going to go. I think both the oligarchs and the neo-Nazis are going to get swept away in the next 6 months, and that the country is basically we're going to swing back to Russia, because that's the main constituency in Ukraine, and that's what the West has been getting wrong all these months. You know, there are huge cultural and social and family and every kind of imaginable tie between the Russians and most of the Ukrainians, also in central Ukraine. And you know, once they get through all these weirdos who have leapt to power in the past few months, they're going to swing back. I think Ukraine's going to swing back, and it's going to be a better friend of Russia than it was when it started this situation.
All right, I'm going to go to Eric.
I think France and Europe are going to be
20 seconds. 20
I
seconds.
really don't think so. I mean, certainly when I'm in Kyiv, they look much more to Poland. They look much more to, I mean, this is two countries in one wrapper. And I just don't think that the Westerners who I talk to are now so anti-Russian. I just don't think you can put it back together.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to Alexander in London. Alexander, you've been on this program numerous times discussing this topic, and we know, both of us know that every time Washington blunders in Ukraine, it's Moscow's fault. At least that's the Western narrative here. But all of us on this panel know something about Ukraine, unlike Western media, and I suppose most policymakers in the West. You can't have a healthy Ukraine without Russia in the equation. Now, with all this demonization, and particularly of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, how do we get to putting Ukraine, at least containing Ukraine's tragedy? Because I'm looking at failed state here. I'm afraid I have to disagree with Charles here. I'm looking at a failed state on Russia's border. Russia can help if it wants. How does this happen?
Yes. I mean, this is a point where I have to say I slightly take issue with Charles. I mean, I think the 6-month time frame that he's talking about is too optimistic, precisely because the United States and the European countries are simply not reconciled to any kind of rapprochement between Ukraine and Russia, or any involvement of Russia in the Ukraine. And without that, and without an agreement between the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans to achieve that, I think it is very difficult to see how any kind of stabilization in what we call the Ukraine, be it in the form of partition, the preservation of a federal structure, or whatever, is possible. So I think that for a time, and I think one is looking here, I'm sad to say this, more like a year, or perhaps even more than that, we're going to see continuing conflict and deterioration there until the Europeans and the Americans finally face the reality of what this situation requires.
Alexander, let me tell you what I think the flaw in that logic is, and that is that you're assuming that Europe and the United States is going to continue backing Ukraine going forward over the next year and a half or so. I really disagree with that, because what's coming out is just how incredibly untenable their proxies have been so far. The war crimes have been committed, the losses that are being hidden, You know, it's just the Nazi crazies who have committed atrocities. I mean, just think of Germany for a second. Germany, which is hyper-allergic to any Nazi issue. You know, when this stuff, and the German media has been the worst in repressing this, but it's not possible to keep under the lid anymore. And it's coming out, and people are starting to realize what's going on. And there's no way they're going to drop those guys like a hot potato and run with their tail between their legs. And when it happens, the only people in the game who are going to be able to do something, who are going to be there to sort of pick up the pieces, are going to be the Russians.
Eric?
So,
yeah, I think that's quite unrealistic.
Go ahead,
I
Eric.
think, quite frankly, they have shown their willingness to continue with losing policies. I mean, look at Iraq. They're still trying. In Ukraine, they cannot simply back away from the position they've taken. And this is basically the problem. We were talking about the media. Well, certainly the American media has this triumphalist, failure is not an option. Well, in fact, in human life, failure is an option. It happens all the time. They've got a failed policy, and they're going to cling to it. And you've got to remember that when we say, well, the United States wants this, or Belgium wants that, or Mongolia wants something else, we're making a mistake, because you don't have, a country is not an individual. It doesn't have one desire. You've got factions within that country. And some people are doing very well off of this situation. NATO generals who were basically consigned to oblivion, all of a sudden they've got an enemy to fight. Neocons in Washington, who were definitely on the out, where they thought they were anyway when Mr. Bush left the scene, are suddenly, they're back, very much back in favor. So there's some people doing very well on this.
Okay, Alexander, to be contrarian here, you know, when we look at this failed policy for Ukrainians, let's stress for the people of that country here, I mean, Victoria Nuland is, you know, laughing out of her sleeve. Okay, they didn't get Crimea for NATO. Okay, it won't be NATO ships there. Oh, well, you know, the country's in a shambles. They're having a civil war, animosity to a degree that will take generations to undo, if ever, and the country's broken, and Russia is going to have to pay for it. Victoria Nuland, check. That's a win for her. That's a good for her. No, Alexander,
Well,
you know, you can look at it that way. Go ahead, Go ahead.
One can look at it that way, and I am sure that there are people in Washington who do think like that. I'm not sure whether Victoria Nuland is one of them, because she's so bound up with this policy. But if one reads some of the things one sees in coming out of the United States, where some people are obsessed with these geopolitical views and want to create dividing lines and have ideas about Russia that they want to isolate it and target it and weaken it. And one can entirely see why these people do not see the policy at the moment as a failure, regardless of the mounting costs it is causing. And until there is a willingness within the US, and I'm afraid it is ultimately the US, to face these people down, I cannot see how this situation, at least in terms of the Ukraine, can improve.
Okay.
Ukraine is a pawn.
Yeah, but Eric, let me, you know, but no one's ever held accountable for any of these things. We can look at these other crises around the world since the end of the Cold War, and that's just the beginning. I mean, no one's ever held accountable.
Peter.
All right,
really
go ahead,
disagree.
Charles, jump in. Go ahead.
Look, people are held accountable for foreign policy mistakes, and a very classic one is, well, how do you think Barack Obama got elected the first time? Okay, because he stood up and he said, hey, I voted against Iraq, and I was against it from the beginning, from day one.
Now he's
and
doing it again.
Really,
No.
Yeah, people.
No.
He's doing it again.
People really believed him. People really believed him, and it was a big deal for the Democrats that
Yeah, but he
pushed
got
them in
reelected.
that election.
Charles, he got reelected, okay?
No, I'm talking
and he's bombed 7 countries.
What he did after that doesn't matter. But the first time he got elected, he ran on I was against Iraq thing, and George Bush screwed it up. The thing is, there's a presidential election coming up in the States. And I tell you, the Republicans and the progressive left and everybody, they're going to hammer the Democrats really hard on this, and they're going to
over Ukraine? I don't believe it. Not over Ukraine. No.
A rallying call of the next election is going to be who lost Ukraine.
Okay, go ahead.
Who lost
Eric,
Ukraine? That's what they're going to be saying.
If you look at Iraq, if you look at Western press coverage of ISIS, the one thing you're not told is who destabilized the Middle East to begin with, who overthrew through all of the secular regimes in Iraq, in Libya, now in Syria, basically chased out the anti-Islamist governments, which may have been distasteful to some people, but were opposed to the Muslim fundamentalists. And now, what do you have? Well, you've got ISIS flowing into the vacuum that was left. But no one is blaming them for the original political mistake which they made. And you're going to see the same thing in Iraq.
In Ukraine. All right, Alexander, when I was growing up and I went shopping with my mother, if I broke something, we had to pay for it. So Ukraine is broken. It was the EU that broke it. The U.S. broke it. Are they going to take ownership?
No, they're not going to take ownership. I think ultimately the people who will have to take ownership, and here I agree with Charles actually, are the Russians. How they're going to do it, I don't know. And we're going to look at a very messy situation over a long time, because I don't see the situation resolving quickly. But I think eventually, this is where I do agree with Charles, I think it will be the Russians who will have to go in and who will have to put the pieces together. And I'm afraid the realities are that they won't get much thanks for doing so, at least not from the Europeans and the Americans.
Charles, well, go ahead, jump in, Charles. This is CrossTalk. Go ahead.
Well, look, I think we're really you guys are really underestimating the cultural and ties that bind these two countries. I mean, it's a little bit, if you want to take an analogy, it's like the United States and Canada, okay? And all this anti-Russianism that's being blasted on the airwaves in Ukraine now is not really representative of what the people think. It's the neo-Nazis who are rather narrow section in the far west. And it's the media that's controlled by these oligarchs. Okay?
Unfortunately,
the people of Ukraine are largely Slavs, and they have the same language, they have the same literature, they have the same religion, and they used to be in the same country just 20 years ago. They've been together for centuries. They've fought wars together. I tell you, these people are much, much closer than is now apparent, and the Russians are going to use this to huge advantage going forward, as the neo-Nazis and the corrupt oligarchs totally discredit themselves.
No. Very good point. Eric, go ahead.
Unfortunately, it just isn't true. I mean, I work a lot with people in Kyiv. I work a lot, and I mean, I've been hearing anti-Russian discourse for some time, and there has been this Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, I've had some fairly surreal meetings where people are attempting to hold a meeting in Ukrainian, and I've got several Russians with me, and everybody finally said, "Would you kindly go into Russian so we can all know what you're talking about?" There has been, and this has been exacerbated. And you've got to realize that when it started in Kyiv, it was not a fascist movement.
Yes.
When it started in Kyiv at Maidan, these were middle-class Ukrainians who had been lied to by Yanukovych, who told them, "You're going to have European passports in a few weeks. Congratulations." And then, of course, there was never any possibility this would happen. They were furious and disappointed. And the neo-Nazis pulled themselves, joined into this movement and took advantage of it, and this became sort of the armed vanguard. But there was a strong Ukrainian nationalist feeling in the West. I still consider it's really two countries.
I don't think that was strong nationalism. I think that was a desire to join the EU and sort of a belief in that fairy tale that they were being told.
We got 40 seconds left. Alexander in London, go right ahead.
Well, I would like to agree with Charles. I'm afraid I can't be as optimistic as he is, looking at the situation and looking also at the history of Ukraine over the last 20 years, where there has been a steady deterioration, a steady radicalization. I think Russia will ultimately come in to step in and sort it all out, but I don't think it'll come as smoothly or as quickly as he thinks it does. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's going to get worse before it gets better, I think.
Charles?
Well, yeah. I agree with that. I agree with that. And I also think fighting is going to break out again in
All right, gentlemen.
I mean,
until we convene again, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.